it's very easy, and to an extent, I think we've fallen into this trap a little bit, probably me more than you, to pull a lot of the blame at Meghan's door. And I think in doing so, in the way the media often do, in the way the public often do, I think that's a very unhelpful trope about wicked women stealing away innocent men, because we tend to think of Harry as the nation's younger brother. But in fact, he was in his early to mid 30s when he met Meghan. He is old enough to be accountable for his decisions, and she should not be blamed for them. Hello, Royal History Geeks. This is Gareth Streeter here, the founder, creator, curator, if you will, of Royal History Geeks. And I am joined by royal commentator and broadcaster James Taylor. And we are here today on the day that the book Spare of the Duke of Sussex is released in paperback format. And we're here to collectively and together review the last few years of this story, the unfolding story of Harry, Meghan and the royal family, and to give what we hope are some balanced and measured reflections on the journey that they, if you like, have taken us on. James, how are you today?
I'm fine, thanks, Gareth. And you?
I'm very well. Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. It's actually, we're recording this in the evening, so it's been a busy day. I'm sure it has been for you as well, but it's nice to relax and do this now.
It is, although how relaxing some of the subject matter is, I'm not entirely sure.
Some more than others, I suspect.
I mean, one thing I would say is that with the publication of the book in paperback, I think it is quite curious that it's come out now, so long after the was published in hardback in January 2023. I know we're going to look back over the timeline in a moment, but also it's been said that from Penguin Random House that the content isn't going to be changed. And usually when a book comes out in paperback, there's a new chapter, there's added information, and there's certainly the scope for that, as Prince Henry attended the King's coronation last year. There's been the illnesses of both the King and the Princess of Wales, and yet there's no new content forthcoming, so we've been led to believe. So I think that's a little bit curious. I can't quite understand why they would have done that. And what's your take on that?
Well, it's very interesting, and it could be one of those things which is just entirely innocent, that there was never a plan for any more content, there was never talk of it, and it's not particularly in vogue at the moment to do that. I don't know. Obviously, as you say, there's plenty to talk about, if nothing else. Just a chapter reflecting on the death of the late Queen, Harry's, the Duke's grandmother, would make sense to do, and it would be some commentary on tribute to her life.
Yes, I mean he did talk about her death in the book, but not in any detail.
That's true. I'm getting my dates mixed up. Of course, it was published in 23, wasn't it? So it was the Oprah interview that was in the lifetime of the Queen.
It was.
Yes, you're right. So but he could have. I mean, but as you say, there are other things since then he could absolutely have talked about. I mean, it's possible, I suppose, and I don't know if this is where you were leading with your question, but it's possible that there's some regret. I suppose that.
Who knows? I think it's very difficult to be able to judge whether there's any regret.
Yes, and
you know, from other interviews that he's given since then, I think that's the very difficult point to be able to judge.
It is. I think that, and we'll go through some of the key events in a moment, but I think there perhaps have been at times statements, or if I were to be a cynic, you could say there's been elements of backtracking on previous occasions. I mean, certainly I know that when I'm very angry about a situation, I feel very differently a couple of years down the line. That's not to say the fundamentals have changed, but there are things I would have wanted to have said in a certain way that I wouldn't want to say later down the line. And as you get older, you learn not to let your first reaction be your final reaction, or a phrase some wise people once taught me was to respond, to reflect and respond rather than to react and regret. And I think it is fair to say that Spare reads like a reaction, and whether there's some regret is difficult to know.
Very difficult. So you said about looking back at some of the events. I think it'd probably be useful if we did that now.
I agree. So I thought we could go right back in time to long before the controversies started, and to remember the engagement of Prince Henry of Wales, as he was then, Prince Harry, as he was popularly known, to American actress Meghan Markle, which was on the 27th of November 2017 that it was announced. Do you particularly remember it?
I do. I remember because I had a call to go and do a slot on TV that evening. I did quite a lot of interviews on the radio as well during the day. And it was also announced that they were going to make their first public appearance as a couple, because the engagement was announced on the Monday, and they were going to make their first public appearance as a couple on the Friday in Nottingham. And of course, I live quite near Nottingham, so right. I was in demand to do commentary on their first appearance, and just the number of people, because they appeared at the Nottingham Contemporary, the art gallery, and so, which is in the Lace Market area of the city, and the number of people that lined the route. I mean, there were 10 deep or something like that, and I had to stand on a wall opposite the entrance just so that I got a good view to be able to talk about it on the radio, to be able to get pictures. And it was in 1st of December, and I feel the cold a lot. And I was well wrapped up, and my legs were quite numb, and I was thinking, how am I going to get off this wall at the end of it? But it was a joyous day. It really genuinely was. So many people turned out to cheer them, wave their flags, speak to them. It really was, and it was I don't know, it's very corny to say, but it seemed like the dawn of a new age almost.
I agree, and I think the wedding, which we'll come on to, really cemented that as well. I think it probably is fair to say, though, and I think we should make this point, and I was reminding myself of some of the background as we were preparing for this, but ahead of the public engagement, Prince Harry, as we should call him at this stage, had issued a warning to the media, effectively, hadn't he, saying, "You're already harassing my girlfriend too much. Leave her alone." So whereas,
and that was only a few days after their relationship had been made public.
Yes.
And he talked about the amount of racism, which I must say at the time took me by surprise, simply because it wasn't really on my radar, or that there was much more said than, and I'm sure that was, because it's been subsequently shown that there had been quite a lot of comment. But to me, all I had seen at the time was that Prince Harry had a girlfriend, and she was American. I hadn't watched Suits, so I didn't know of her. So that was really all I knew, that he had a girlfriend, that she was an American actress, and that was it. And so I was surprised. I must say that the statement that he released at the time was very strongly worded, and to me seemed a little out of place, because I wasn't aware that, because he used the term dog whistle racism later, and I must say I wasn't really aware of the extent of it until much later. It did take me by surprise, and also because it is a departure from the way in which the royal family would normally react to a situation.
Yes,
they would either say nothing or something more generic, rather than what he said was actually very personal, and far more so than I would have expected.
Yes, and I think Harry, even then, was carving out a niche. I think he often filled quite effectively, of being slightly freer, which is a sort of second son privilege in some ways, or the spare privilege, to use the lexicon that we'll be going into, where I think you can deviate from the royal family script a bit.
You can, but I'm sure he wouldn't see being the spare as being a privilege.
no, he doesn't, and I'm not saying it's an undiluted privilege by any
No,
means. But I think one of the things, and I think this will come out more when we talk about, let's go on to talk about the wedding. Is one of the things I loved about the wedding, and I'm not as interested in weddings for the sake of weddings as other people are. I'm not a major sort of fan of dresses and art and stuff that might be associated with weddings. But I think royal weddings are fantastic. And what I sort of loved, and I sort of saw this as a real benefit of having a wider, bigger royal family, which is something I personally enjoy just as a subject, was that, yes, the Cambridges wedding, as they were, William and Catherine, was the traditional royal spectacle of a wedding, which is the sort of thing we're famous for on the world stage, and is just a wonderful thing to be able to have. But the great thing was the wedding of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, as they became that day, was different, and it was a different kind of spectacle, and it was a different kind of moving and connecting and powerful. And I thought, well, isn't this wonderful that we've got enough breadth within the royal family to be able to do a bit of both? And I think there was so much optimism around, for me, what the Sussexes as a couple could do in that regard, that I think it's a shame that we collectively as a society and they as individuals weren't able to really make that work in the long term.
I wholeheartedly agree. I was there for the wedding. I wasn't able to get a hotel room in Windsor, despite the fact that I booked it as soon as the date was announced. I could only stay in Slough, so I got the first train out of Slough that morning at something like 4:45, and then got a space on the High Street in Windsor near the Guildhall, and so I was able to then see the couple and their attendants when they had the carriage procession. And I think as well, having it in Windsor was a great statement, because Windsor Castle is a wonderful venue. St George's Chapel is a beautiful venue, beautiful church. If you've never had the opportunity, I would say go. Certainly now, to see where the late Queen and Prince Philip are buried, along with her parents. But it filled with royal history, because of course Edward VII and Queen Alexandra married there. But yet, as you say,
Prince Edward married there, didn't he?
Yes, and the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh were married there too, or Earl and Countess of Wessex as they were at the time. And it's, so it does seem it's less formal, I would say, than being in London, but it also has just a beautiful atmosphere. And it's, for all that St George's is a grand building, it is essentially the royal family's parish church, and so it is. It had more of an informality around it, and certainly I think that wedding did, and you could tell that with the guest list as well. And so I think that so many people had either stayed out there or got there very early, like I did, and the crowds in Windsor that day, it was completely, utterly packed. You couldn't fit. They'd had to put extra buses on to run shuttles to be able to get people to anywhere to be able to leave. It was so busy and so packed, and of course we saw the Duchess of Sussex wearing the tiara, which had belonged to Queen Mary, hadn't been seen for 60, 70 years, something like that.
Right.
Again, so yes, we learned later in the book that there'd been an argument about which tiara she might wear and things like that, but at the time there was no evidence of that, and it just seemed that she was being welcomed, that the vault had been opened to her. I must say, given the optimism at the wedding, later when a lot of the details were revealed about the anxieties around it, I was surprised, because none of that showed on the day.
No, and I suppose at the end of the day, the royal family are a family, and even families we know very well can still surprise us with what goes on behind closed doors, and arguably that's just part of family life, and there's a curse to it, but there's a huge joy to it too. And having family squabbles isn't amazing, but at least you've got family to squabble with, and not everybody does. So I think it's very easy as well when problems flare up later to remember things. And I know I do this. I remember previous events through the lens of a later conflict sometimes, and they seem, and I'm not claiming it's deceitful. I don't think it is. It's just your current understanding of the situation colors your previous understanding of situations.
It does. I mean, I'm not somebody who likes looking back, which I know you're thinking.
Yeah. Do you not quite sure you know what we're doing on these podcasts? But
no. I enjoy looking back over other people's stories and over history, but I don't particularly like looking back over my own life, because I always think that if I'm looking back over a time where I was particularly happy, I can't help but compare to, well, how am I feeling now? Why aren't I as happy as I was then? And if it was an unhappy memory, I don't really want to be reminded of it. So I wouldn't go down that same route myself, but I can see where you're coming from, and I can see why you would do that.
And then the ceremony itself, I thought, was wonderful as well. I think, I like preaching, so I thought Michael Curry was fantastic. I thought it was.
I'm not sure the Queen thought he was so fantastic.
No, she might not have done. But then the Queen has got her late Majesty had a very resting, neutral face, didn't she? Which could appear grumpy. And there was talk of that. We had the same criticism after the Cambridge's wedding as well. And do you remember, because there was a lot of media attention to, the Queen looked like she was grumpy, she released a smiling picture of her with the now Earl of Wessex, Viscount Seven at the time, which was clearly done as, oh no, look, she's a cheerful grandmother too, sort of thing. So, and again, and I think Beatrice and Eugenie were laughing a bit, weren't they, at sort of, but I thought it was wonderful. And powerful message.
Queen did seem to enjoy the gospel choir, though. She did seem to be enjoying that particularly. So yes, I think it was. I think it was just a beautiful ceremony, and something which I think it's a shame that now, when Prince Harry looks back over it and reflects on it is affected by all of those contingent factors that went on around it at the time. We didn't know any of that, and it just seemed like the most beautiful, happy wedding.
And they did seem happy. And I mean, to go back in terms of looking at relationship as well, I mean, I was crying when the then Prince of Wales walked the then Meghan Markle into the church building. I know. I don't cry very often, but I do cry at those sorts of things. And when he walked her in, and their lip readers quite early on could see that Harry said to his dad, "Thanks, Pa," as she walked him in. And obviously there'd been that drama about her father in the run up to the big day. And that all seemed wonderful. And Meghan's mum looked so happy as well, and looked like everyone was looking after her, and including her.
Yes, yeah. It did all look like a very happy, joyous family occasion.
It did, and it seemed, again, and this is very different, because again, of course, I do fully appreciate that we don't see behind closed doors, and nor should we. But after the wedding as well, that optimism seemed to carry on. And Meghan was, I think, a breath of fresh air, because as someone who was, yes, a princess, yes, a duchess, yes, a member of the royal family, but because she wasn't destined to ever be queen consort, Harry was not destined to be king, they did have a freedom to explore things. And it said on the royal website that Meghan identified as a feminist. And, now, personally, I don't know if I do identify as a feminist. I think it depends on the definition, and people have different definitions. But I think it's great that she was able to say stuff like that and have a platform to kind of be a slightly different voice to the traditional voice that didn't prevent the traditional voice shining either.
I mean, I would say that sometimes that was perhaps a little bit overplayed, given that when she was attending events, that agenda was used quite a lot, and sometimes when it wasn't probably as relevant to the event she was attending. But I do agree, it was marvellous that she was given that voice. She didn't seem to be restricted too much in having her interests. The royal family didn't have to allow her that platform. They didn't, they could have said, "Oh, you shouldn't talk about this, you shouldn't talk about that." She seemed to be a lot freer. than people imagine.
And it might be she had to fight far more behind the scenes for what
Yes,
may have seemed like
that I
small
really don't know.
victories, and we just don't know. But it was good for the royal family too, though, and I think that's the point. And I think had that the chemistry been right and it been able to work, the Sussexes being slightly not on the peripheries, but slightly outside the main sort of dynastic trajectory, if you like, of the royal family, could have allowed them that freedom to explore things in a slightly different way, in a way that brought huge value and expanded the horizons and the perceptions of the royal family, but being in a safer space to do it in the way that, yes, the Waleses now do push boundaries in a different way, but it has to be so much subtler and it has to be so much more careful. And of course, the current king did as Prince of Wales, but again, it has to be careful. It has to be, constrained.
I mean, I would say a good example is probably the Duchess of Edinburgh. When she has been involved in subjects such as abuse of women, female genital mutilation, things like that, which she's probably had more scope to be able to involve herself in those types of subjects than, say, the Princess of Wales would.
And I suppose the advantage of the Duchess of Sussex is she's obviously of a different she's of the next generation of the family, so would have done that in a way that was more relevant for a new generation. I'm not saying that it's irrelevant the way other royals are doing it.
No, and also had a very different lived experience, having come from America, having worked as an actress, and having been in Hollywood and all of those things. So she had a very different type of lived experience too,
and being mixed race as well, and having grown up in a mixed racial household. It's just these things do give people insights into issues, and I think being able to pursue them in a way that would have it's always going to be more constrained how you do things as a princess, how you do things as an actress. But I think it seems to me that a role was being carved that would give them both a reasonably high degree of freedom that they maybe they wouldn't necessarily recognize, but from the outside it looks like it was.
Yes, and certainly from her perspective, we must remember that she'd been involved in humanitarian work for a long time before she became a member of the royal family. It wasn't just a fad or a new or a passing interest. It was something that she had been interested in. I mean, she worked as an intern at the United Nations as a young woman. So I think that it is fair to recognise that as well, that it was a continuation.
Yes.
A very different platform, but certainly she was carrying out the same type of work that she had done previously. And I think that it's fair that we should recognise that too.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think if she did feel, or they did feel, constrained by not being able to go as far and as fast as they would have liked, I think the only caution or qualification I would add is they must remember that as Royal Highnesses, they would be getting doors open to them and have a bigger voice as Royal Highnesses than they would, even though Meghan did have a reasonable profile beforehand. She would have far more of a voice and a platform as a Royal Duchess. So it is not wrong that the royal machine is involved and places some boundaries and limits around what is effectively their intellectual property, if you want to look at it as coldly as that.
And also, one should say that a lot of the scope that they have now, even though they have not been working members of the royal family for nearly 5 years, is still down to the fact that Prince Harry is the son of the king, and therefore that has given him a much higher profile than either of them could have imagined outside of the royal family.
Absolutely.
Yes, Meghan did have a profile as an actress. She was successful, and she had used that to forward her interest in being a humanitarian and being a feminist, all of those things. But that was never going to be on the same scale as being Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex and being the King's daughter-in-law. So I think that they still benefit from having doors open to them now.
Yes,
that they wouldn't have had they not been.
Yes, and it's a very fine line, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, particularly Harry, he is who he is, and he can neither help that nor should need to apologise for that. So it's not just he's not just applied for a position, have it and
No.
had it. He's intrinsic to who he is, who he intrinsically and genetically and socially and culturally is interesting to us, and therefore we'll always engage with him. It's not just that he's sort of stealing an identity. But nevertheless, you could understand, and we'll come on to talk about perhaps some of the restrictions that have been placed around them in a moment. You could understand why the royal machine is going to want to do what it can to put some boundaries around, as I said earlier, what's basically their intellectual property in terms of titles. In terms
and I think it's fair to say as well that some of that is done for their own protection, not just to clip their wings. Although I think that that's probably the way in which Prince Harry, certainly the way in which he's written about it in Spare, you would see it. I think you have to be fair to say that sometimes those restrictions are there to prevent members of the royal family from getting into difficult situations or from lending some support to commercial ventures which may then fail or whatever. Those restrictions are sometimes there to protect them, not just to restrict them.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And let's look then at in terms of restrictions and as things started to change, because it might be that I wasn't paying close enough attention. Certainly, I don't pay much attention to gossip about the royal family, but I do keep an eye on mainstream media. But things seem to be going well, for the sense that they were the Fab Four, the Cambridges and the Sussexes, working together, launching initiatives together, being interviewed together. It all seemed to be working out rather well. But then on the 8th of January 2020, and at this point, we didn't know 2020 was going to be such a big year. They issued a statement, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, effectively saying they were stepping down as working royals and would be looking to relocate, but were still happy to do some duties on behalf of the Queen. And that, to me, came as a bit of a bolt from the blue. How did you react to it or hear about it? Or
well, it didn't. I mean, I had been asked the previous. They did their tour of Australia the previous autumn,
right?
And that was when ITV had done the documentary following them, and Tom Bradby had asked Meghan how she was, and she gave that rather tearful reply of, "Thank you, nobody ever asks me how I am." And so I think at that point, I was interviewed on the radio about it, and it was at that point that I realised, perhaps something isn't quite right. And it was announced that they were taking some time out, so they didn't attend Remembrance Sunday that year, and they were, and they spent some time in. Well, we didn't know where they were at the time, but they spent time privately, and turned out that they'd gone to Canada. But I think it was at that point that I realised, there's something that's not quite right. However, I wouldn't at that stage have thought they're not going to come back.
Okay, so you were following it more closely than I was at the time. Then, so when you heard on the 8th of January, it wasn't a complete bolt from the blue from you then.
It was a bolt from the blue that they were stepping down, yes, but it wasn't a bolt. I had expected there to be some more of a compromise, that they would perhaps spend more time away, that they would spend more time either in America or Canada or wherever, but that they would still be working members of the royal family, but would have more privacy, more time. Because of course, remember Prince Archie, or Archie Mountbatten Windsor, as he was known at the time, was born the previous May. And so they had a very young child, and it was natural that they'd want to spend more time as a family. And we have to remember that the Cambridges, as they were at the time, had come in for quite a bit of criticism themselves for the relatively small number of engagements that they were carrying out. And they lived in Anglesey, away from the public spotlight, so that they were able to have more time as a family. Certainly when Prince George and Princess Charlotte were first born, a little bit less so with Prince Louis, as by that time Prince Philip had retired, so they were both carrying out more engagements, but certainly they were given more time as a family, which of course the late Queen wasn't. Her father became ill soon after she married, so she didn't have that opportunity, and so I'd expected more something along those lines, that they would probably spend more time overseas than in the country, but there would be more latitude given for them to have more family time. Now, yes, it was a surprise that they stepped down altogether.
In fairness, because there's quite a lot of ambiguities in the 8th of January statement from what I remember at the time and from what I've checked out since. Because my understanding, now you will know better than I will whether this is correct, but my understanding is there have been conversations ongoing between the Sussexes and the royal family for some time. The Sussexes felt it was taken too long, so they preemptively released their statement on the 8th of January, which had not been agreed, effectively to force action from the palace. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding of it. And of course, the word that was used at the time was blindsiding the Queen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, of course, after the Sandringham Summit and the Queen gave her statement.
Sandringham Summit was on the 13th of January, just so people know the date. So that's 5 days after.
Yes. After that summit, which, of course, Prince Harry has written in spare that he was present, but Meghan wasn't given the opportunity to be present at because she had already returned. She'd already returned to Canada. The Queen's statement did make it clear that there had been conversations going on for months, but it did also appear that that decision had been made without, that they'd released information before it had been properly decided. And it seemed to me that that they had forced the hand of the Queen and of the royal family to have that conversation when they wanted it, and to be able to release that information as quickly as they wanted.
It does seem so. But to go back to your point about how you're expecting perhaps more of a halfway house, it does seem that initially the Sussexes were hoping for more of a halfway house, in that it sounds to me, and this came across in the Oprah interview a bit, that it was a bit like they wanted the sort of Michaels of Kent deal, whereby they would be royals, not do official duties, but be on hand if anyone for particular things. And they particularly wanted to live in Canada because it was still within the Queen's realm that would enable them to do so. However, and they, as I understand it, were not particularly happy that the Sandringham Summit, of which a statement was released on the 18th of January to summarise what was agreed, it basically effectively declined their offer to be part-time working royals.
Yeah, so you can't be half in or half out. I think, looking back, I think that was a mistake. I think that there was the potential for a compromise there. However, whether, do we know all the details of the way in which that conversation was held? There could have been terms, and I seem to think there might have been terms that made it difficult or made it unreasonable to be so. But I do think that, until the last generation, we'd had members of the royal family who had gone to be governors general of Commonwealth realms, and there were even discussions, relatively recently, that the Duke of Kent would have been in the 60s or the 70s. So it's not something which is unreasonable to have imagined them living abroad and carrying out royal duties, but it obviously was deemed to be unworkable.
And I do wonder whether, and this is entirely speculative, but because they had blindsided the palace by going public and breaking ranks, whether that eroded any trust, the trust that may be necessary for a halfway house model.
Well, that's the way in which I tend to think. Again, it is speculation. I don't like to speculate too much, but I all I would say is that there seems to be some discrepancy between what seemed to be a reasonable suggestion of we want to spend more time away from the spotlight, we want to spend more time as a family, possibly overseas, and saying that we also want to be able to carry out, to be able to carry out duties as well. There seems to be some discrepancy as to how that could have happened, because Prince Harry is right. There are other members of the royal family who do have that type of agreement. You've mentioned Prince and Princess Michael. Of course, the difference with them is that they didn't receive any public funding, not even from the Queen. So the Queen reimbursed members of the royal family for carrying out official engagements. So Prince Michael's brother and sister, the Duke of Kent, Princess Alexandra, and also the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, would receive money from the Queen's annuity. to be able then to carry it, so they were not out of pocket carrying out official engagements. Prince and Princess Michael never were. However, they did used to attend state banquets, for example, and they had on occasion represented the Queen at the banquet given by the corporation city of London.
And they had heavily subsidised accommodation, didn't they? The Queen paid their rent effectively, which I guess it would be a quid pro quo for doing the odd job. Yes. For the royal. I mean, I think it's difficult, isn't it? But I think also between the 8th of January and the Sandringham Summit on the 13th, we have to remember that there was a very mixed public reaction. So there was quite a lot of anger, and it depends what circles you're in, of course. But there was quite a lot of anger that they were just swanning off, where people felt they'd been invested in. But there was also some things where I think they struck the wrong tone, and I think this is something they've done consistently, which perhaps is probably a bit of a bubble mentality. But I think the way they worded their original statement, I don't have the statement in front of me, but they said something like, when we're in the UK, we shall continue to choose Frogmore Cottage as our residence or something. And bear in mind, at this point, the taxpayer, and this has been quite well publicised, had just spent millions. Was it 4 million?
And quite reasonably so, because if they're going to have accommodation, then it does need to be of a decent standard. Frogmore Cottage hadn't been lived in for several years, so it did need work carrying out to it. However, yes, as you say, if they are then going to use that only sparingly, then you can understand why people would be annoyed that they're.
Well, I think it was also the tone. I knew even quite a lot of proper monarchists as well. You know, I'm not talking about, we're saying, when they're saying we shall continue to use Frogmore, it's like, oh, will you now? Well, let's just hang on a minute. If you're not working for us, you know, and now, actually, there's a lot of confusion with royal finances. A lot of time people assume things are public money or publicly owned assets when they're not. They're private money and they're privately owned assets. Nevertheless, I thought there was a bit of tone deafness in the way they wrote that. And I think as a result, the Sandringham Summit was dealing with a bit of a public backlash. It was mixed. There was huge support as well for them, and it was quite divided by generation. But I think that by jumping the gun, and I understand the process must have been frustrating for them if it was dragging on, but by jumping the gun, they may have forced the palace's hand or the Queen's hand into not being able to give them the halfway house deal that might have taken longer to tease out.
But I mean, one thing that I think has counted against Prince Harry and his public perception since is the way in which he's written about the Sandringham Summit and spoken about the Sandringham Summit, when he has described the Queen as sitting there not speaking, not really taking it in, and that his father and his brother were the prime movers in that, and that has led some of his supporters, I'm not saying Prince Harry has said this, but certainly some of his supporters, accusing them, i.e. the current king and the current Prince of Wales, of elder abuse. I think that is far removed from the evidence that we have. But equally, Prince Harry did, when he visited Her late Majesty just before the Jubilee in 2022, say that he was going there partly to see that she had the right people around her looking after her. So I do think that he has, if not misled people, he has certainly done nothing to correct that narrative. And so I think that the way in which that has been handled has not helped him and his public image at all.
No, I agree. So just going back to our timeline, 18th of January, we have this announcement, which basically says the Sussexes are going to live overseas. They will not receive public money. They will fund their work commercially. I thought the way they said that in their initial statement was slightly patronising, actually, because they talked about a progressive role, which is, I think, a very loaded term. And again, when you look at what they've done since, to know whether to make many, many, many millions of pounds through selling a story, how progressive that is, I'm not sure. But anyway, that's by the by. So they would go live overseas, they would fund themselves, they wouldn't receive public money. And when working commercially, they would not use the style of Royal Highness. And that's how I ended up getting more involved in the conversation through my social media, because Actually, I'm more of a medievalist Tudorist that's also a big monarchist arranged with the royal family, but I don't consider myself a commentator on the current royal family. However, I do know a lot about royal titles and styles. So a lot of people were asking me, how's this going to play out in practice? Does it mean they've been stripped of the style of HRH? I said, well, no, it doesn't. If you look at the wording carefully, they say they won't use the style commercially. So in theory, if they're still attending an event in their capacity as royals, they would be styled as HRH. And I just assumed at the time, now this hasn't how they've used the style, but in the same way that members of the nobility, when they are working commercially, so for example, Viscount Lindley, as was the now Earl of Snowdon, when he was working commercially, just called himself Mr. David Lindley, used his title as a surname. So I just assumed that it meant if, for example, the Duchess of Sussex would star in a film, she'd be credited as Meghan Sussex. That sort of was my take on it.
Yes, and in the same way that, I mean, the Duchess of Kent gave up her public role more than 20 years ago now. Now, she doesn't appear mainly because of her age, really now. But you know, she worked as a teacher in a school, was known as Catherine Kent, when she attended things like, because obviously she set up a music charity, and so when she attended things like award ceremonies, she was referred to as Catherine, Duchess of Kent, which is the style for a divorced peeress, which she isn't, but you know,
yes, or a widowed,
which again she isn't, but you know, used that as a compromise for not using the style Her Royal Highness. However, if she attended any royal events, so she did attend things like Trooping the Colour, she was at the Sussex's wedding, she was at the unveiling of the memorial to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and so in the court circular, she was still credited as Royal Highness the Duchess of Kent, even though she didn't use the Royal Highness style and title herself. So I think that would have been the reasonable style and compromise that we would have expected from the Sussexes, that if they attended any royal events, they'd still be known as their Royal Highnesses, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, but they'd be known as Harry Sussex or Meghan Sussex.
Yes,
if they were doing their commercial ventures.
I think it's just that the royal family were keen that HRH didn't become a commodity that was sold commercially. Now, to an extent, you can't avoid it because you can't separate the status from the person. That's sort of the whole point of the system. So you can't avoid it altogether. But I think we're just trying to put a bit of a safeguard around, as I say, the intellectual property of the royal family.
Yes, and the use of the website Sussex Royal.
Yes,
was something which they then began using. Archwell instead. Yes,
which is much more appropriate, I think.
It is, but then they've sort of gone back on that later, haven't they? But you know, at the time, they gave the undertaking that they would not use the word royal. I mean, they couldn't stop them. Well, it'd be difficult to enforce it anyway, but they couldn't be stopped from using the Sussex name, because that is essentially their name as well as a title. But the use of the word royal. That does indicate that there is certainly a sanction from the monarch to be able to use.
Yes, I think that's right. And I mean, there's been so much. I've seen so much debate about titles, etc., since this has all happened, and there's been a lot of call for the king to strip them of their titles. And I think it's just worth remembering that yes, they could be stripped by letters patent, which would be very easy to do, of HRH and Prince and Princess. However, I don't think either of them have done anything to warrant that yet, although there's one particular area I think they need to be very careful. But actually, to remove Harry of his title of Duke of Sussex, which is a peerage title, could only be done by an act of Parliament. And when you look at everything Parliament has got to do, at what point could you possibly justify not doing a bill on schools improvement, or, you know, provisions for the elderly in order to pass a bill on the removal of a dukedom from Prince Harry? And people say, oh yes, but it wouldn't take very long to push that legislation through. Well, actually, that legislation would be open to amendments, and people might kind of put all kinds of amendments on a bill like that.
And I have some sympathy with that point of view, because yes, to put a bill through Parliament could be done relatively simply and the time limited. However, there is inevitably going to be a huge amount of debate, both in Parliament and outside. And so I can't see it going through quickly, even if.
And it can only be time limited if Parliament agrees it's time limited.
Quite.
So, if you did, and we've obviously now, currently in Parliament, we've got a very, very big Labour majority, and that means there will be more Republicans, for example, in Parliament than there might have been previously. I'm not suggesting that's the dominant flavour of Parliament or the Labour Party by any means, but there's probably more than there were previously. So putting any bill like that, which you don't need to, could be higher risk than it needs to be.
And also, what would they call themselves? That Harry and Meghan Windsor.
Or are they Harry and Meghan Mountbatten Windsor? I guess they would be.
But even Windsor or Mountbatten Windsor. Well, because they seem to use the styles interchangeably, certainly with Lady Louise, who is credited either as Lady Louise Windsor or Lady Louise.
Although that was clarified at her birth, is that she was Lady Louise Mountbatten Windsor, but she'd be known simply as Lady Louise Windsor.
Yes. But they could do the same. I mean, they could use the title interchangeably if they chose to, because several people with double-barreled names may choose to use both of them or may not to. But they'd still be associated with
exactly.
You can't get away from that. Remove the title, fine, but you're not going to divorce them from the fact that Harry is always going to be the king's son. However, whatever style and title he's known by, you are not going to get away from that.
And his appeal and interest comes from. No, I completely agree, because the reason people are interested in him is not because he's called the Duke of Sussex. The reason people are interested in him is because it's because he's exactly as you said. He's the king's son. He's Diana's son. He's William's brother. He was the Queen's grandson. He is a well-known figure. That would change. And also, you can remove someone the title. As far as I know, people could still keep calling him Prince Harry. There'd be no. I mean, I think if I wanted to, I could style myself Prince Gareth. I don't think I'd be breaking any laws, as far as I know. No, I could change my name to Prince Gareth.
You could, and you do see.
I might do that.
You see on social media quite frequently, where you can buy the title Lord or Prince or whatever. And also, if you look at I don't like using them as examples, because I think people draw too many comparisons that aren't really there. But the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, when the style Duke of Windsor was held that only he could be a Royal Highness, that she was not going to give the style Royal Highness, which I think did look very petty and vindictive on the part of George VI and Queen Elizabeth. I'm sure they were also following public opinion, but I think it did look petty and vindictive on their part. But of course, the Duke of Windsor did insist that all of their personal staff, as Her Royal Highness, that they did bow and they did curtsy. And so even if you restrict the use of the title, that does not stop them using it. And so I think that it would be, for that reason alone, it's rather futile.
I make my staff bow to me. I just think it's good practice.
Of course you do.
Yeah.
In fact,
particularly household staff, definitely groundsmen. It's just good practice.
I'm very astonished and relieved that you allow me to call you by your first name.
I don't. I want to talk to you about it. I think it's very disrespectful. I just assume that you're a work in progress. Anyway, and then so go back to our timeline. Anyway, what do I do? Ish. Going back to our timeline, so then this new arrangement was in place for a year, trial period. That trial period ended on the 19th of February 2021, where it was confirmed. And at this point, to use emotive language, Prince Harry particularly was stripped of his royal patronages.
Yes.
And which, of course, and I understand why this is emotional for a lot of people, because he had been a serving officer. And actually, when we do come to talk about the book, I think his account of his time in service is really powerful. But I could understand why he perhaps had, among the royal family, he was one of the more credible people to hold high-ranking military appointments, and he did have to give them up as a result of this arrangement. And I can understand why that would sting a bit. Yeah. And then, not long after this at all, on the 7th of March, we have the infamous interview with Oprah Winfrey.
We did, and the timing was particularly unfortunate, given that Prince Philip was in hospital at that time. It was just over a month before Prince Philip died, and I think that, they could not have known at that when they gave that interview. So I think that we can't blame them for that. Some people have. I think that's unfair.
It is unfair also because he was 90, he was 99.
He's 99.
I mean, so
no, and had been in failing health for a
Yeah.
while. But I think that even so, the timing was still very unfortunate. Did bring a lot more stress on the late Queen and on the current King than perhaps was necessary and would have happened otherwise. Because I mean, the Oprah interview just opened a whole other can of worms, particularly around the subject of racism and the royal family. I mean, there's just no getting away from that. And I do think that for them it was a misstep, and I do think that it was very clumsily handled.
So for me, and I've got a few confessions to make at this stage, because I think it's really important that it's impossible to view any subject, but particularly one like this, objectively. So therefore, I think the better thing to do is to declare biases and let therefore people listening to this, both of you, decide, weigh our comments against our stated biases and no doubt some biases that we're not as aware of. And it was at this, I had been a reasonably solid supporter of the Sussexes using my limited social media profile up until this point, in that I recognised, I kind of got the arguments about, look at the investment that's gone into them and surely they should have known. I sort of like, yeah, I see that. But at the end of the day, you can't possibly know what it's going to be like being in the royal family until you're in the royal family. And as a result, you need to be given a bit of grace if it turns out it's not what you want. And the royal family is a family firm. Within each generation, there's going to be people it doesn't work for. We need to find a way of allowing people to gracefully exit centre stage if that's what's right for them. So I've been quite supportive. The Oprah interview, for me, has put me in a very different side of the debate. I still have sympathy for them. I still recognise there are things I can't understand about their situation. But it is at that point onward that I have detected, I think, a degree of callousness on their behalf and find it very difficult to be supportive of them. As a result, I didn't watch the Netflix show, which I suspect we're going to come on to talk about, because people just told me it would make me too angry. And I'm like, well, do you know what? I'm a medievalist. I don't need to do this. Why watch something just to make me angry?
I mean, I admit I did watch it, but I only really watched it because I didn't want to, but I knew I was going to be asked about it.
You're a royal commentator. You had to. You had to. You're a royal commentator in a way that I'm not. But I just wanted people to know that, because also I need to declare I didn't finish Spare because it made me too angry. And actually, one of the reasons I didn't want to just sit there and read and get angry is partly because it's not that good for you, and partly because I actually do want to still look favourably upon the Sussexes in many ways, and I don't feel like I do that by engaging too much with their content. But I want people to know that, because I'm not speaking from a position of having digested everything, and I think that's important to be honest about now. We go back and talk about the Oprah interview now, but I just wanted to say those things then.
Yeah, I mean, I have seen and read more of their content, and I must say, the more I've seen and read of them, the less sympathetic I am. Not to say I don't have sympathy for them, because I think that you'd have to be very callous and very hard-hearted not to have sympathy for some of the things that they've had to face. But I think you're right. That's where a certain tone of malice has entered the discourse. And I think that once you've got to the stage where you are deliberately trashing your family or deliberately trashing the people, that is where it alters from your airing your grievances to you're just trying to get even, or you're trying to settle scores.
Absolutely.
I think that is less, you do have less sympathy because of that. But I think that, I mean, the two things in the Oprah interview that really made the headlines. The first was, of course, the issue of Prince Archie's skin colour before he was born. And of course, the other was around Meghan's mental health and her attempt feelings of wanting to take her own life. To look at the first one first. all I would say is that I think that I have found the reaction to what was said both understandable, but also some of it unjustified. So and remember, the circumstances of this is that Prince Harry had been in a conversation with one or more unknown individuals who are members of the royal family about the skin colour of Prince Archie. This is before he was born, so they didn't know that it was a boy necessarily.
Yeah.
That's of their unborn child, and that there were conversations and concerns raised. That they were the words that were used. However, this was reported by Meghan in a stage of the interview where Harry was not present. So he was not able to corroborate this, was not able to give any more information. Oprah Winfrey did not ask for any more detail. Well, she asked, are you going to name the person? Meghan said she wasn't. She did not then follow that up with a question to Harry during the joint portion of the interview. So there was no opportunity at that stage for them to give more information. And it must be said that a year later, 2 years later, nearly, when Spare was released, Prince Harry said that they hadn't alleged that anybody was racist. It was the media that had said that someone was racist, and that it was actually unconscious bias. All I will say is that I think that based on what was said, it was very clumsily handled, because it is essentially a second-hand account that somebody has said something which you find concerning. And I think that I am all for people acting as whistleblowers. So I'm equally... I think that it's dangerous. There have been two main schools of public thought on this. Either people have said, oh, it's nothing, everybody speculates on the colour of skin of a mixed race child, in the same way that they would say, has a child got ginger hair or blue eyes or whatever feature. And then there are other people who've said that it's extremely racist and that the whole monarchy is rotten to the core. Now, the fact is, because we don't know who said what and what was said, of a person of a reasonable level of intelligence is not able to make an informed decision.
Am I right in thinking, because I feel like I heard this somewhere, but you'll know whether it's true or not, that when the Duke of Sussex became aware that the Duchess had said that to Oprah, that he clarified with Oprah that it wasn't either of his grandparents?
He did, and that was after the interview was, well, certainly after the interview was recorded. I don't know if it was after it was in. And so Oprah Winfrey did say that later, when she was asked in interviews that she gave after the interview with Meghan and Harry was aired. So we knew that it was not the late Queen, and we knew that it was not Prince Philip.
And I assume that's because everyone thought it would have been Prince Philip. I suspect, because he has made racially clumsy comments, or has been reported to have made racially clumsy comments in the past.
It's more than been reported. I mean, he you know, it is a matter of public record that he did make them, because some of them were caught on camera. Right. But yes, so Prince Harry was at pains, apparently, to point out that it was not either of them. But that still meant that there were several other members of the family who were then, you know, there's an awful lot of speculation, as there would be, as to who had said it, but we don't even know what was said. So, you know, we're not even able to make an informed decision about, oh, well, this sounds terribly racist, and it's terrible that these people are enjoying positions of privilege in our country. Nor do we think, oh, actually, it was something that was really innocuous. We simply do not know.
No, we don't know. And I think you summed it up very well. I mean, initially, I will confess, some of my thinking was, well, it could have well been an innocent question, and it could just be curiosity and something a bit clumsy. But the more I've thought about it, I thought, well, do you know what? You know, I as most people know, I'm gay. I'm in a same-sex relationship. And I can think of times where maybe in a family situation, a wider extended family situation, or in a social situation, people have asked questions which are not unkind, but are clumsy. And you know what? It can be grating, and it can be insensitive, and it can be hurtful, and it can be something that is a cause of concern and does sometimes need addressing. I can't for the life of me imagine how going public or semi-public about that is a better way of addressing that than addressing it within the family, or asking someone to have a word, or whatever. But nevertheless, I've not been in that situation, so I don't. I can see that there could have well been something that caused harm and needed addressing. But I think your point about to just sort of quite vaguely to make, given how rightly sensitive these issues are, to effectively incriminate the entire royal family, except perhaps for the late Queen and the late Duke of Edinburgh, was a pretty savage blow. The other point I just wanted to make about the other point that came up with race in the interview was the Duchess of Sussex strongly implied that the reason that Archie was not a prince was connected to her racial background. And the reason that I found that flabbergasting and incredibly irresponsible, and I am going to use strong words to describe that because I think it's necessary, is that there are two factors at play as to why the now Prince Archie was not a prince. The first one was that he was not entitled to be because he was too low down in the generations of the family. Because, as we know, the rules were established by George V. Meghan said George VI in the interview, but she meant George V. We can forgive her for that. The title of the style of Royal Highness and the titular dignity of Prince or Princess goes to the children of the Sovereign and the children of sons of the Sovereign, and then the eldest son of the Prince of Wales. The late Queen extended that last clause to accommodate William's children because they get the title anyway, so she extended it to all children of the eldest son of the Prince of Wales. So Harry's children would not, in the Queen's lifetime, have qualified for that status, but under the normal rule, they would have become HRHs, princes and princesses, when the grandfather succeeded to the throne. However, which is of course what has happened. However, it was well known for many years before, among those of us that keep a reasonably casual eye on the royal family, that Charles, when he became king, was known to want to shrink down the royal family and restrict the royal style only to those of the direct line of succession. And long before I'd ever heard the name Meghan Markle, I have written a blog post, it's on the internet, people can see it, where I state very clearly that this is the expectation, that Harry's children will never have royal styles. And that was before we knew about Meghan. So if I knew that, I find it very hard to believe that a prince and a princess did not know that. And if they didn't know that, they need to have shown far more responsibility for doing their homework before making those kinds of comments.
Well, and again, those comments were largely through unspoken words.
Yeah.
It was, this was the reason why, without giving a reason.
Yeah.
And it was assumed that this was why. And also, I think that what was never understood and never explained was why they chose not to use the courtesy titles that they were entitled to at the time.
It was apparently because, just to give people, what happens when, under the rules set out by George V, children, male line great-grandchildren of the sovereign would use the same title as the children of dukes. So in the case of Harry, who is a duke, the senior nobility, so dukes, marquesses and earls, always have a second title, a more junior title called a subsidiary title. And Harry is the Duke of Sussex, but he's also the Earl of Dumbarton. So as a courtesy, if he were a non-royal duke and they weren't in the royal family, his son would use the title Earl of Dumbarton during his father's lifetime. So when Archie was born, his parents had the right to style him Earl of Dumbarton. I have heard, and I don't know if this is true, and the fact you don't know this might mean it's not true, that the Duchess of Sussex did not want him to be called Lord Dumbarton because it sounded like dumb, which obviously in America is a bigger, more commonly used insult than it is here.
I have heard that said. However, what it doesn't explain, I can understand why they may not want to use the title Earl of Dumbarton. However, the other title was Baron Kilkeel, which again they could have chosen to use, in the same way that the current Duke of Devonshire's son is not known as Marquis of Hartington. He is still known as Earl of Burlington, which he was the style and title he used during his grandfather's lifetime. Also, if they didn't want to use that, he could still have been Lord Archie.
I don't know if he could. I mean, this is tricky. I don't think they could have skipped over the Earl of Dumbarton title, because that would have been such a slap in the face to Dumbarton that I don't think they'd have been allowed.
It is possible to do that. I mean, there are precedents for doing it.
But the only precedents that exist are ones that wouldn't create any kind of political reaction because no one knows about them.
But the fact is, though, that they failed to explain why they chose not to do that, and so that by not explaining why they chose not to do that, they made it sound as though he was not given a princely title and therefore had no title. They didn't explain that it was in fact that they had chosen not to use it because they weren't happy with that title, and also, one would have assumed that if they were not happy with that title at the time that it was granted, knowing that their child would have been known, then there could have been a discussion in the same, not quite in the same way, but if you look when Prince Edward married Sophie Rees-Jones, they were created Earl and Countess of Wessex. Years later, they were also created Earl and Countess of Forfar. So they had a Scottish title, and of course that is how. And of course now Edward is Duke of Edinburgh, but he still has that subsidiary title as Earl of Forfar, and his son could be known as Earl of Forfar, is in practice known as Earl of Wessex, but could be known as Earl of Forfar. So they didn't explain that, and also when Lilibet came along, why she was not Lady Lilibet.
Well, I guess if I'm going to defend them a bit on this one actually, because I think if they did want to go with Earl of Dumbarton because of the Dum reference, I can understand why they would have been discouraged from saying that publicly. I can understand how they may be told it's that or nothing, because as soon as you do another, if you just do Lord Archie, Mountbatten, Windsor, there's a perceived snub to Dumbarton. Can you imagine I have no idea who the MP for Dumbarton is, but they would have created a fuss about it. Yeah, I could understand why they were told it's that or nothing. And then once you've done it for Archie, you then can't call Lilibet Lady. So I kind of get that.
I realise that and I accept it. My point really is the fact that they didn't explain any of that. And of course, it's their prerogative not to explain it. But by saying he was not given the title of a prince, and therefore he was known simply as Archie Mountbatten Windsor, without giving that explanation of why they chose not to use a subsidiary title. Because remember, the whole issue about the Dum reference has only come from other commentators. It has not come from Harry or Meghan's lips. And so therefore, as far as I'm aware, is no more than speculation, or at least third-hand information.
I think I read, I can't cite my source, so it's not very helpful, but I think I read it as someone saying that Meghan had said that to someone. So
she may well have done. My point is, it's still no more than a third-hand reference, like the
that's right. That's
and
so
right. Therefore, we're not able to give to really substantiate it, and so therefore it just seems my point is it was still handled very clumsily, and it implied that there was far more malice on the part of the royal family, and because of the issue of race, without them actually stating it. And I think that because they, again, it goes back to the whole issue of they said a little, didn't explain themselves, and so therefore conclusions were reached, which may or may not be accurate, and we've no way of knowing if they are accurate.
There is not a doubt in my mind that the Duchess of Sussex was trying to imply that her son was not a prince because of her racial background. There's not a doubt in my mind that that's what she was saying.
Not mine. But the fact is, you cannot. But then it's very difficult for you to backpedal and say, "Oh, actually, that's not what we said. That's not what we meant," when you can't really give an alternative explanation for it. And just on the issue of when she talked about life was so difficult, her mental health was in a precarious state at the time, and she had thought of taking her own life. I think that, again, the way people reacted to that was extremely unfair. You can't know.
I agree.
State is. What I will say, though, is that because Prince Harry had set up heads together with his brother and sister-in-law in advance, and also because he was accessing therapy himself and had been quite open, and I always thought that was a great thing that he'd been so open about accessing therapy, because it helped break down barriers and break down stigmas. I will say that it did seem rather unlikely that Meghan was not able to do the same. Now, she had said that she was discouraged from going as an inpatient, which I can't say whether that's true or not. But it does seem very unlikely to me that she was refused any kind of help, given that her husband was accessing the same kind of therapy. I think
and other royals of the past had as well.
Well, Yes, Duchess of Kent being a prime example. For me as somebody who has, I'm not an insider, but it seems to me rather unreasonable to say, could he not have rung his therapist and asked if Meghan may also see him or her? I think that's a reasonable thing to say, but I do think that I do draw the line when people saying she can't have had those thoughts. How can we possibly know or judge whether she had those?
No, I agree, and I did a talk to a group quite soon after, people saying she's clearly like you see her out and about looking perfectly happy. It's like no, that's not how mental health works. Someone could put on a smile for the outside world and be absolutely crumbling inside. So I don't accept. I
No.
completely agree. She's told us she's had those difficulties. I think many of us would in similar situations, and she absolutely should have support. I think in terms of the mental health access, there may be a slight cultural difference in that, as I understand it, and I'm no expert, that in America, being an inpatient for such things is much more common. Going to rehab is much more common than is done here. So it would have seemed like far less of a noteworthy, newsworthy thing, perhaps, than it would in our context. So there may have been some sort of cross US UK wires there, and maybe that's where some of that stemmed from. I don't know. That's just speculation. So we're coming to the end of part one. We've talked about the wedding, we talked about the engagement, we talked about the wedding, we talked about what started to go wrong, the settlement, and we talked about Oprah. When we come back in part two, we're going to talk about the Netflix show, and we're going to talk about Spare and the public reactions to both of those things and how they've shifted the debate. I just wanted to summarize, though, as we end part one by saying, in terms of my reflections on all the things we've talked about, it's worth being clear how much of an opportunity the Duke and the Duchess of Sussex and their union and their potential work together for the royal family could have been brilliant for the royal family, could have been brilliant for the nation, and could have been brilliant for the Commonwealth. And I think it's a great sadness, without apportioning blame to anyone, that could not be made to work. And I think we're all the lesser for not enjoying the talents of the Sussexes. And the other thing I just like to say, which I haven't said in this part, is that it's very easy, and to an extent, I think we've fallen into this trap a little bit, probably me more than you, to pull a lot of the blame at Meghan's door. And I think in doing so, in the way the media often do, in the way the public often do, I think that's a very unhelpful trope about wicked women stealing away innocent men, because we tend to think of Harry as the nation's younger brother. But in fact, he was in his early to mid 30s when he met Meghan. He is old enough to be accountable for his decisions, and she should not be blamed for them.
No, I agree. I think that, and of course, accountability is a big part of Spare, which we will go on to.
Yeah.
But I think that if we believe what Prince Harry said, that he had those feelings of being unhappy in the family and wanting to leave from frontline royal duties since he was certainly in his early 20s, then I think it is very unfair to apportion all of that blame on Meghan. My own take on it is that I don't think she has forced him into anything that he didn't want to do. She may have been a catalyst, she may have encouraged him, but I don't honestly think that he has done anything that he was not
I agree.
willing to do himself.
She may have given him the confidence, and she may have shown him how to do it, because I think it's not unreasonable to say that she may be a more towering intellect than he is. But he is old enough to be accountable for his own actions, particularly when it comes to managing relationships with his own family.
Indeed.
Well,
and I do and as you said, I think it's just a very sad situation.
It is.
And I don't see a resolution to it anytime soon.
No, I think you're probably right on that. Well, we will be back in part two, which will drop at the same time as part one. So if you want to go listen to it, you should be able to go listen to it straight away. We'll talk more about this. We'll talk about Netflix. We'll talk about Spare, and we'll also take some listener questions. I will look forward to speaking to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this Royal History Geeks one-shot podcast episode. If you would like to check out the rest of our podcast series or episodes, go to royalhistorygeeks.com/podcasts. And if you'd like to get involved with the debate, discussion, and dialogue online, then check out Royal History Geeks on Facebook, X, Instagram, and Discord.